Hello and welcome. This is the Mutiny Investing Podcast. This podcast features long-form conversations on topics relating to investing, markets, risk, volatility, and complex systems.
Welcome to the Mutiny Investing Podcast. I'm Jason Buck, CIO at Mutinyfund. My special guest today is PJ Pierre of Denali Asset Management. PJ has a long history of being an autodidact trader, starting in FX, trading across multiple asset classes, eventually being mentored, for lack of a better term, by Warren Mosler, and now working with hedge fund market wizard Scott Ramsey at Denali, and Scott's going to hate me for mentioning that. So he's right from the jump. I'm really impressing your crew over there at Denali. But I want to start with why you don't drink coffee. I'm just joking. Right before we got on, PJ told me he didn't drink coffee. I'm on like my fourth coffee of the day, as you can hear by my voice. Maybe that's why I talk so fast. That everybody complains I talk too fast, and it may be due to my coffee consumption. And maybe I should slow down. Maybe that means that's why I don't sleep enough either. But I'm going to start with maybe the hardest question first, PJ, and that is Warren Mosler the most interesting man in the world?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think he's definitely in the running. He's definitely in the one of the nominees, if you ask me. But
because people don't know, outside of
he would disagree.
Well, that's because he's so humble. Like, he's amazing. So outside of MMT, which, people are either pro or con these days, and he was an amazing trader, made a ton of money off Italian bonds back in the day. But more importantly, he has, what is it called? The quad hull ship that he built. He basically designed and had built down in the Caribbean. It's a quad hull because it can manage the waves better than a monohull ship. So that's one of the things he built on the side. He also built his own car company, was the P900 back in the day. He was trying to build race cars.
MT900.
Okay. And then and so these are his side hustles. This is what he does in his spare time, and lived down the Caribbean for most of his life. I think he's also found the fountain of the youth because was he in his 70s now, and to me he looks like he's in his 40s. So this is my pitch. What I'm doing is I'm pre-selling the biopic that I'm going to create about Warren Mosler, the most interesting man in the world, to take over the Dos Equis guy. But I mean, you got to spend a lot of time with him. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of little details, but what you also just referenced is his humility, right? Like, he takes his time to teach people. He's never the biggest personality in the room, and tries to deflect as much as possible. And is that a fair statement?
I think so. I think one of the things that I always found interesting about Warren is how charitable he is to everyone. It's, it doesn't matter how often I go, what's this guy saying? He's not making any sense. And Warren goes, well, he's right in the context of fixed exchange. So it's like, it's like one of those dynamics where he could kind of always find the silver lining, or always find a way to be, magnanimous and charitable, which I think makes him a pretty interesting person. I mean, the whole dynamic of how, he came to be one of the driving forces behind, the proliferation of MMT has to do with that same, charitable dynamic where he was, funding research and putting together conferences, sort of out of his own pocket, just because he thought this was information that was useful and needed to get out there. I mean, he's run for office a couple of times.
Oh yeah, that's what they see. I knew I was forgetting stuff, and I forgot. Like, he ran for office in the Caribbean and in the U.S., if I remember correctly.
Yes, and most of the time, I mean, and I think in 2000, I want to say maybe in like 2012, he ran for president, and I don't even think it was. I mean, I think the idea was he just wanted to kind of run on the platform of a payroll tax holiday. And he wanted to just get that platform out, and thought that would be good for the economy. And then eventually the Obama administration adopted the payroll tax holiday, or Obama administration in Congress. So then he dropped out, mission accomplished. So it's definitely interesting the way he kind of sees things, and then the way he kind of, gets up and tries to do something about it.
Yeah, besides even like the Obama administration, taking on that payroll tax holiday, you've told me a bunch of other private stories, and I don't want to blow up Warren's spot, but like where he's almost like in the best sense possible, like Forrest Gump, he ends up talking to a lot of politicians, administrators, and his ideas get adopted by other people, and they get all the credit. And like you said, his humility is like he doesn't care as long as his ideas got implemented. He doesn't even want credit for his ideas.
Yeah, I mean that goes in the world of finance as well.
Which is shocking in the world of finance. Everybody wants credit for their ideas, even if they only had 5% of the idea. Everybody's going to pretend like it was theirs.
Oh, yeah.
And so so obviously part of your Mosler background, but it's not fair. I loosely use the term mentorship because what I think you brought to it is not only what you learned as an autodidact trader, but also what you've learned from like your new unique path in life, as we all have unique paths, is then you took in what Warren was saying, but like, if it didn't work with the way you viewed the world, then you didn't, it wasn't like you just took everything Warren said, hook, line, and sinker. You were like, does this line up with the way I view the world? And then, so you had your own thoughts about it. So that's why I really wanted to do a podcast with you, because I love our private conversations. And especially if you have that kind of monetary or money view framework, it's something that we can all use as a better foundation. And you already referenced fixed exchange rates. So maybe kind of unpack that a little bit for us. What did you mean when you said that worked in a fixed exchange rate world or a fixed rate world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could kind of dive right in there if you want, but I don't know if you wanted to sort of do like a little brief bio or so on first.
No, let's just dive right in. We'll figure it out as we go.
Cool. So, yeah, I mean, in the reference of fixed exchange, it's, I'm pretty sure most of your listeners are aware of the fact that we currently are on a floating exchange rate system where, the dollar isn't convertible, at a fixed rate to any other asset. The only thing, if you walk into the Fed with $100 bill, the only thing that they're going to offer to give you is 250s or 520s or so forth. But, nothing else. So in that framework, there are certain dynamics that, that just are different than if you were, in fixed exchange. And, one of the things that I gravitated towards, with the stuff that Warren Mosler was teaching was the fact that a lot of the prescriptions that sort of come from the mainstream macro models were sort of kind of leading you to like your conclusions were almost 180 out, right? Where it's like almost the exact opposite things happening. Like, Standard & Poor's or Moody's, downgrades US debt and interest rates go down, not up. Bonds rally. So it's like, and then so you have to ask yourself the question, so, why is that different? Or, anyone who's familiar with, bond markets and especially Japanese government bonds is familiar with the widowmaker trade where, lots of people, based off of everything you learn in the text, thought it was a good idea to short Japanese government bonds based on their debt ratios and those aspects. But, the rates kept going lower and lower and people kept losing money. So it's like there was a lot of, for me, it was kind of easy to sort of come to sort of gravitate towards what's now known as MMT. I'm not a huge fan of the name. I don't think it's really, I don't think there's really much theory in modern monetary theory. I think it's just kind of descriptive. And, judging from my background, like one of the jobs that I had before I actually stopped working for anyone and just trading my own accounts was, I was an automotive technician, right out of high school. And, I used to do electrical diagnostics and, all sorts of, engine control system diagnostics and stuff like that in cars. And one of the things I always think of, like, as it relates to finance is, if you brought me a modern internal combustion vehicle and I was diagnosing your car and, diagnosing your running problem, and I said that you needed to replace your fuel injectors, it wouldn't make sense for you to tell me that, yeah, okay, but your knowledge doesn't apply to a carburetor. It's like, well, no, I mean, the description I gave you for fuel injectors describes that system. If you give me a carbureted car, I'd give you a different description. And, like, so as it pertains to fixed exchange, to me, it's like, some of the things that we describe when we're describing the modern monetary system were applicable to fixed exchange. So they were applicable to a carbureted engine, but they're just inapplicable in the world of, fuel injected or floating exchange, to overuse the analogy.
Yeah, and I'll say, and maybe say it in a different way, because we had a lot of animated conversations when we were in person down in San Diego. And I think part of it is like, that's what I was going to try to bring out on here is like things that make you angry, or things that like you hear a lot of times in macro space or FinTwit that upset you. And one of them, like you're saying, is like a lot of people's understanding of the world is based on this fixed exchange rate. And basically their thoughts are outdated the way the monetary system works. And so that's what you're dealing with all the time, is like people are saying things that like only apply maybe in a textbook from the 1950s. But when we start talking about monetary operations as they are now, and it's like, it's descriptive when you talk about monetary operations, not prescriptive. And that could be very frustrating for people like you or Warren. And like you said, Warren, his equanimity is impressive, and so is yours too. But like, I know I can get you a little heated sometimes if I poke and prod you in the right way. But I'm wondering, you brought up, being a car mechanic. It made me think about a lot of times, even if you learn about monetary operations, and especially if you have a mechanic's mindset and you're trying to figure out a closed loop system, right? You can kind of figure out a way a closed loop system works. And that's most of the things that humans invent are a closed loop system. But when we start talking about an open loop world of like finance or global macro environments, is like, no matter how much you may understand monetary operations, there's something outside of that closed loop system that can affect monetary operations or something else. Like we've talked about before, is like you have internally, public and private, balance sheets internally in America, but then you have to worry about the foreign exchange. Like there's always some sort of like confounding variable outside that system. So to me, that's an interesting transition, because usually if somebody's a car mechanic or like an engineer that I talk to a lot of times as clients, is like they have a very closed loop mindset, but you have a very open loop kind of view of the world to realize maybe what you don't know, or there's a lot of form of integrative complexity. And I'm wondering how you kind of like made that transition to be a lot more open-minded than thinking about the world in a very mechanistic worldview.
I think for me, it was probably because I sort of came at auto repair as kind of just as something to do, like to try to, work my way through school at the time, with the idea that I was going to, do this job and then find my way back to, get a degree or so forth. But I sort of came at it from the perspective of someone who was very much into like, the science of how things work. That's the reason why I found the job interesting. It was like, all right, here's another thing for me to figure out how it works. Growing up, my dad would always explain to me, how, a CRT television works, or how, the difference between a parallel electrical circuit and a series circuit. And so, these sorts of dynamics. So for me, when I came at auto repair, I think I was kind of a bit open-minded, because the concepts that I was sort of applying were much broader than just in that narrow system that I might happen to be analyzing. So, it's like you said, that there's always like a hidden variable potentially, even in a system that you think you understand, there could be some component factor or some, exogenous, influence that's sort of driving a result that's different than anything you've experienced. And then so like in finance, it's like you said, like, being an autodidact, I also like to consider myself like an armchair physicist. So I would read a lot of books on theoretical physics and, and those kinds of concepts. And then you really start to challenge the concept of how much do you really know, in a system, right? Like it's Schrodinger's cat, like, us humans learn by making measurements, but every time you make a measurement, you're influencing the system. So you become one of the component factors of your measure. So objectivity is lost and it's all subjective. And, so once you start to kind of apply it with those kinds of things, you kind of move with an open mind. And then for me, I think the other thing was, especially moving into finance, was it would have been hard for me to kind of have a closed mind when everything that I was told seemed to be not accurate. So it's like,
what do you mean by that? Give an example.
Well, so for example, like you would, when you start to like learn about finance and you learn things like, so one of the main tenets in like macroeconomics is basically the concept of savings being like the precursor to economic activity. So we spend from our savings, we invest from our savings. And for me, it was always kind of backwards, because to me, it's like, well, I would have had to earn something to have saved in the first place. So the dynamic of, loanable funds models, when you start to, try to learn about banking and economics and, fractional reserve banking, you start to realize that some of that stuff just doesn't, like, there's like dislocations, or it just doesn't fit the real world whenever you actually start to analyze these things. It's these dynamics where you get these stylized stories where, our monetary systems progress from a system of barter, and then due to the necessity to sort of lubricate said system, we came up with a monetary system, and then which would have started with like hard currency, so specie or whatever, some sort of commodity currency, most likely. And then to further lubricate that system, we then would come up with a credit system and overlay that on top of that. And then it would create these dynamics. And I guess it's maybe it's the confluence of all the experiences I had to that point, where for me, it was just kind of simply put that, credit most likely would come first, because, monetary arrangements are based on credit to begin with. Like if I have a tax obligation, I pay it. That was a credit. I owed taxes. That's a form of credit. I discharge that debt by, bringing that which is acceptable in payment of taxes, and, the relationship collapses. So, it was real easy for me to understand that, just as in physics, we talk about, the theory that the universe, expands and then possibly will someday collapse. It was kind of easy for me to understand that credit systems and, money aggregates sort of expand and then contract based on economic activity and based on credit systems and so forth. So, I think it's a quote. I'm not sure who to attribute it to, but it goes, economics is a science of confusing stocks and flows. And to me, that's something that always resonated with me, because you see it kind of play out, in all levels of econ, where, the difference between a stock and a flow sort of gets confused.
Exactly. So there's so many things you said in there I want to pull on, different strings I want to pull on. One, I'm glad you brought up physics, because when you were talking about your childhood and the way your dad was educating you, remind me of Richard Feynman and his dad and stories of his dad. And I was like, how fortuitous to be raised that way. And then you start talking about physics. So I'm sure you probably read the books about Feynman and the way he was raised and how his dad always had a questioning mind and was getting him to look a little deeper to how things work. But the other one you brought up, though, in physics, what I also can't stand is a lot of times people will go, well, like a physicist, I reason down to first principles. And right then I go, well, you just disqualified yourself, because which branch of physics are we talking about? If you think there's first principles, quantum mechanics and everything will tell you there's not really first principles there. So yes. It's like go ahead.
The statement betrays the ignorance, right?
Exactly. They haven't asked enough questions. Like if you thought you stopped at foundational principles, you need to keep asking questions. You actually didn't dive deep enough. But it's always interesting to me. They invoke that like they're a deep thinker, and I'm like, you just, to me, negated yourself right off the gates on that. I was kind of thinking like, I could go in the direction, like I said, of what annoys you. And you start referencing like, do I save first and then, then I spend money, or do I earn first and then I save and I spend money? I'll even start with like something as basic as, should we run the government like a household budget?
All right, so I'm gonna try to keep my cool in this podcast, even though
no, I'm gonna get you
to push my buttons. Apparently,
yeah.
Well, yeah. So it's, the short answer is no. We shouldn't run the government like a business. I mean, the government's stated purpose isn't to somehow extract resources from other agents in the economy to its, to somehow accumulate wealth or something. I mean, that's not the purpose of government, of collective government. So, government's purpose is to serve public purpose. And in many ways, the institutional arrangements that are set up around creating a government and the institutional structures, like a system of laws, property rights, all these sorts of dynamics that lead to the sort of kind of free exchange that we enjoy today, that creates a productivity and all the real wealth that we enjoy, is a system where the government is, or at least in my opinion, I think the government should almost be necessarily countercyclical. And I think that, private individuals are by definition pro-cyclical. So yeah, the idea of running.
But PJ, we should get rid of the budget deficit. The government deficit's killing us. What are we supposed to do about that?
Well,
and
none
those
of
who
us
can't see
dead.
the video, I'm smiling.
Yeah, I mean,
like,
yeah, right. So, I mean, you hear it. I mean, fortunately, what I will say, we could address that, but what I will say is you don't hear that as much as you used to. We've had some of the largest expansions of fiscal policy that we've seen in basically like war footing type of expansion of fiscal, in response to the COVID pandemic. And, no one's talking about, solvency. No one's talking about going bankrupt or leaving debt to grandchildren. Everyone's focus is on inflation, which is, I think, where it correctly should be. Whether or not this footing is going to lead to, inflation that's somehow detrimental to economic growth and prosperity and generation of real wealth and productivity and so forth. But yeah, I mean, by definition, I mean, you and I know this, and I think more and more people are beginning to know it, but like, it's a simple macro accounting identity that the public sector deficit is the private sector, is the non-government sector savings to the penny. I mean, it's like, where else would it come from? When we talk about, household wealth, when we talk about, the wealth denominated in dollars accumulated by the rest of the world, global reserve stocks and so forth. I mean, where do they think that currency came from? That those balances that are saved on private balance sheets are negative entries on the public, balance sheet. It's just basic double entry accounting. And, it's not really that controversial for people who understand that, but it still brings up lots of animus if you bring that up at like at Thanksgiving with your uncles or at cocktail parties and so forth.
Well, what you always talk to me about, and I think is key, is like everything has two sides of the coin, right? Every asset needs a corresponding liability, and that's what we need to always think. And the cancellation thereof of the two, double entry bookkeeping, like those sorts of things is what we always talk about. So one of those is like you just said, like I just want to once again highlight it again, is that like a government deficit can mean household savings. So like we're showing like household savings are some of the largest they've ever been, but also at the same time, obviously the government deficit's one of the largest it's ever been, because those are like offsetting each other. And there's difference, between public and private versus, households, corporations, et cetera. But another part of that, like you almost referenced about, do I spend out of my savings or not, is like, why do we have taxes? Maybe that's the question. Like, does the government spend out of the taxes they collect, and that's the government budget?
Well, I think that's actually a good thread to pull on, because, when I think that was like the main insight that I could say for me uniquely came from Warren Mosler. I don't have any like original ideas as it pertains to macroeconomics. I just was able to absorb the information that I thought just fit the world as I saw it best and just makes more sense. So to me, it's everything I understand about economics is just pure force of logic. And so to me, it's this concept of, the government, in order for the government to spend, it first has to collect taxes. And, I think that's a good place to start because, going back to like my father, when I was a kid and I would ask my dad, why is money valuable if it's just a piece of paper? Like, I don't understand. Like, how's that work? And then my dad said, well, money's valuable because, the piece of paper just represents, America's stock of gold reserves. And, at the time that my dad was telling me this was probably, early 1990s, we were long since off the gold standard. Yep. He may or may not have known that or not, I don't know. But, so as a kid, it was enough to make me kind of go, okay, so it's valuable because of gold. But, I was always a curious kid, and my parents, encouraged that curiosity. So, however, I don't know how much time it took, but then, I came back with the next question. Well, but why is gold valuable? And so then you get to like this regression, and like quickly my dad was like, well, I mean, gold's valuable because it's always been valuable. And then, and even as a kid, I'm sure he could see it on my face that I wasn't satisfied with that answer. It's like, it couldn't have always been valuable. At some point, someone had to decide this is valuable and get others to agree.
Just like every kid, as you know, like, and we happen to do this in finance all the time because we're trying to do our own work. We're autodidacts. We're trying to figure it out. If you ask somebody, like a little kid, like if you ask them why 3 to 5 times, they tend to break down and just like a parent's like, because I said so. And you find out who actually knows what they're talking about or not. So sorry, I interrupted. So then you went to gold and he said, because it's always been valuable because it's a shiny yellow metal. Yeah.
Because it's always been valuable. And then, at some point or another, I think I was like much older. I think I had to be like probably elementary age when I was asking those questions. But then I think I was probably much older. Maybe I was, early teens or whatever. And I was kind of talking to my father and I said, but if the currency is issued by the government, right? Like if you counterfeit currency, you go to jail. Everyone understands that. The only people who could, mint, coin or print, paper currency and it be legal, is the US government. So I would kind of always, ask the question, if the government has to, and I didn't know the answer to this. So like, it's not like I had some sort of insight. I just knew that the information I was getting didn't fit in my head. So I sort of accepted it as fact that the government did spend from taxing. But what I couldn't understand was if the currency that we use to pay our taxes is the currency that it can only be issued by the government, I didn't understand how we ever got the currency to pay them in the first place. So in the first instance, I didn't understand how the first person made that tax payment. I can understand that if the government collects the dollar and spends it, pays it to you, you could then use it to pay your taxes. But if the government needed the dollar from one of us to pay you in the first place, I didn't understand. I didn't know how you start that. It was circular, sort of like this circular logic that I didn't know how to, like what angle to sort of come at it from. But it wasn't a big deal. I just kind of moved on. I just kind of accepted that there are people who understand these things and right. I'm just not one of them. I just haven't done the work, or I haven't run into the right person who could actually give me the answer I was looking for. And, as you said, being an autodidact trader, I had already spent sort of years kind of reading, studying, and learning about the financial markets and still never got a satisfactory answer to that question. I mean, most other people didn't ever even seem to be asking that question. And, one of the things that resonated with me was in talking to Warren, Warren would say, the thing he said was, the sequence is the government spends first, then it collects the tax. And, for most people, they probably hear that and they go, most people who are reasonable and logical could go, okay, I understand that makes sense. But for me, it was like so much more than that. It was just full circle. Because it's like, the government spends first. It's like I always understood that, because to me, I sort of imagine like this situation where, the Greenback is created, during the Civil War. And I kind of just thought that there was like some distribution center where the government came and said, come trade in your other money thing for this new money thing. Because I was like, how did they get the money out there in the first place? But then when I understood when Mosler said the government spends first, then it collects taxes, then for me, it was like, okay, that's simple. You don't have to have distribution centers. You don't have to get people to exchange their crowns for the greenback. You just spend the greenback, on things, and then that's the same currency that you could collect, when you collect tax payments. But that also leads to a regression, right? Where you go, okay, well then if that's the case, then why would anyone accept the greenback from the government? Is the next logical question. Okay, if the government spends first, but if the government's spending paper currency that it printed, off on, near worthless paper, why would you and I exchange our goods and services to the government for this greenback? And what resonated with me further was Warren actually had an answer to the next question. And it was because of the tax obligation that the government imposes on you. The government imposes a tax obligation. You now owe 100 greenbacks. And so your question is, well, what's a greenback and how do I even get that to pay you? And the government says, well, we're looking for soldiers. You're able-bodied, show up, and 1 month's, 1 month's conscription gets you, 300 greenbacks. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. So I could earn enough greenbacks to pay my taxes and have something to save. So if I don't necessarily have to show up and get shot at in the next period because I earned, enough to save. And so I quickly kind of gravitated towards, okay, now I want to learn more about this stuff because now this makes sense. And I'm the kind of person that if something doesn't make sense to me, I kind of can't move forward. I just kind of get hung up. It's actually, it's probably not a good trait. Like, if I'm reading a research report that might have a useful nugget, but there's a line, in the middle of the report, but there's a line in the beginning that doesn't make sense to me, I'm just not going to ever make it to the middle to find that useful nugget oftentimes, because I just kind of, I start racking my brain as to, how to make sense of this thing that doesn't make sense. So once that sort of started making sense to me, it was a lot easier for me to sort of kind of look at the world of finance and kind of understand these things. And the most surprising thing to me wasn't just that what I had been taught before was backwards. That wasn't what surprised me the most. What surprised me the most was that almost everyone was taught the backwards, description as opposed to what I believe is the more accurate one. When I first learned this, I kind of thought, okay, now I've finally been initiated. I've finally been let in the room where everyone knows that the government spends first. And then, quickly, like Warren's like, well, no, but like no one seems to know this.
This is secret. This isn't secret. This isn't a secret knowledge or secret call. It's just nobody cares.
It's like,
and everybody believes that.
Like if you say this out loud, people are going to like maybe laugh you out of the room. And then so I was a bit disillusioned that dynamic. I'm always one of those guys who's sad when, you hear the story about, a physicist who comes up with a great theory and then his, contemporaries just kind of ruin him because he challenges their work and then he's only like vindicated, 30 years after his death. That kind of stuff always bothers me. So to me, I was kind of like, wow, if no one knows this, then so what does that mean about, what are those implications for everything else you hear when you hear, the government needs to get its fiscal house in order. So they're wrong about that. And then the answer is, obviously you hear, they are wrong in that sense.
One of my favorite stories about that is Ignatius Semmelweis used to deliver babies, and they were wondering why all these, when they're in delivery, like how many babies and mothers were dying. And what he started to notice was, and this is pre-germ theory. So down in the basement, all of the medical students would work on cadavers. They wouldn't wash their hands. They'd come deliver babies. And he was just like, pragmatically and just running personal experiments. He's like, hey, I think we should wash our hands after touching cadavers before we deliver babies. But to your point, he got laughed out of the room. Everybody treated him like a pariah. And then ironically, he died of sepsis. So once again, it's just like full circle, and then later on, we find germ theory, everything, and he was vindicated, but who cares? It didn't happen in his lifetime. But part of the narrative you told, and I think they always use the historical antecedent of a military, right? And that's the way they first spend and then collect. But also part of that tax collection with your military then is like, we get the collective security or violence. And that's what justifies also that this is why people will pay the tax and use the greenback. But what I'm really curious about that transmission mechanism, if it was historically used for a large military based on the populace, is now like in America, less than 1% of the population is military. So is that like, that's no longer a transmission mechanism really, right? Like we can't really think about that's the way you could really value the greenback that way.
Well, I mean, I think in the analogy, in the model, the military is just sort of a stand-in for the goods and services the government demands. I mean, in the modern world, the government demands all sorts of things. Congress needs to get their physicals once a year. They need to get, whatever, resources they need to, pay for the studies that fund the bills that they sponsor. And, the military doesn't just buy, it's not just soldiers in the military, but it's equipment, it's R&D, it's, the military college and studying, strategy and so forth. And so, I mean, the government sort of demands goods and services that probably touch almost every sector of the economy, these days. And, you could argue it might have it may have always been that way. There's probably just more sectors around today than there were, in the past. But, I think it's useful to sort of use the military because it's a simple stand-in for something that you just know that a government would demand, right? The government needs, the crown needs its military force. And, you could just as easily use food. I mean, the crown needs food from the farmers, like the king doesn't grow any food. And, so like, I feel like when I was growing up and learning about history, you would like hear taxes and you would like, I think in most like grade school history books, when they're talking about ancient analogs, they would kind of describe taxes as being paid in kind, right? So, I mean, I think even the Bible's that way. So like, in Egypt, the Pharaoh, the guy who grows grain pays the Pharaoh his taxes and grain and so on and so forth. The guy who, the silk trader pays the Pharaoh in silks. And, I think that's probably just something that sort of comes from, maybe lazy, like anthropology or lack of actual anthropological study. Because these kind of systems were sort of always monetized. I mean, to the degree that there was a monetary system and that the king or, whatever form of government you had, whether it be a monarchy or some other, the Roman Republic, to the degree that they issued some form of currency, they almost always, bought goods and services in said currency and then collected said currency in return and taxes. And then, yeah, there are times where you would, if you might cut out the middleman and, you could just, you don't have money, but you have grain. So the tax collector accepts the grain in kind, but it was more as like a mediation to, your inability to meet the obligation in currency than the normal course of things. But yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it today, you see that there's this economy that's so much bigger than just the government. So it's hard for people to think that, well, the government spends first in the modern economy, because it just seems like, we're in a world where, there's plenty of savings, the distribution of those savings is probably not as equally distributed as we would like, but the nominal amount of savings is large enough that you could imagine that the government could just, finance the budget by taxing the private sector. But you can only do that so much, right? If the federal government ran surpluses, you eventually get to a point where the private sector runs out of savings and can no longer meet its tax obligations. So it's a regressive policy that regresses the economy to, GDP to zero eventually. And so, I mean, so obviously you wouldn't want to do that if your goal is to promote economic growth. The only reason you would do that is because you, for some reason, thought that the government needed to, or that the government would be better off for having a surplus. So the government would be better off for saving its own IOU, so to speak, its own liability, which, also doesn't make sense and is completely inapplicable. I mean,
collecting IOUs, like
collecting
your own IOUs,
sense, right? In an accounting sense, the federal government could have, a budget surplus, but in any real sense, that's not meaningful. That's, if to the degree that we understand that the U.S. dollar is, U.S. dollars are, Fed liabilities, U.S. treasuries, treasury securities are treasury liabilities, the things that we consider money good are liabilities of the federal government. What sense does it make to conceive of a situation of the federal government being wealthy in its own liabilities? Like, American Airlines can't be wealthy in its own air miles. Just doesn't make sense. I could collect credits from Walmart, and if I have, if I have $10,000 worth of Walmart credits, that's an asset to me. I could go in Walmart and I could demand, I could purchase goods that, are paid for in those credits. But Walmart issues those credits out of thin air. They're its liability, not its asset. So it's like what you said before. It's the other side of the balance sheet for them.
One of the ones that used to drive me nuts during the pandemic, and nuts is I'll talk about it in a different way. Is like the idea that a lot of restaurants were issuing gift cards during the pandemic, and everybody thought it was nothing but a good thing, 100% a good thing. And I applaud every nature of wanting to help their local restaurateurs, but that was a liability on the balance sheet of the restaurants, and everybody missed that. And so they're issuing that and they're getting cash, but then they have, whenever they open back up, they've got this liability on their books, and people are going to come wanting to spend those gift cards. And people didn't realize that, like, I understood the sentiment was beautiful. They're trying to help the restaurants, but it was a liability on their balance sheet. But I also felt like I was screaming into the wind when I was saying that, because you just sound like a horrible person. But like I just was trying to be honest about that. Gift card is not just free money. That's a liability on their balance sheet. So that was one of the things that drove me crazy. But also other things you'll typically hear, like we were saying at let's call it Thanksgiving dinner, that might drive you nuts. And I try to ignore them. That way I can maintain my Zen posture in the corner with a cocktail, is the idea that that banking is fractional reserve banking. So tell me about how banks actually, create money, or what banks actually do, and this myth about like fractional reserve banking, whether it's partially a myth, but maybe not fully a myth.
Yeah, I mean, it might go too far. I mean, currently right now I would say it's not the way the system works. So to a degree, I guess it's fair to call it a myth. But I mean, I think it was fair to say that that's the way the system did work when you have a fixed exchange system. When you have a fixed exchange system, you have something backing, the currency, whether it be a gold system, or you have a dollar peg if you're Hong Kong, or, or some nation with a currency board. You have a situation where, you could argue that that's fractional reserves, because to the degree that there's leverage in the system, then you have a fraction of reserves with respect to the balance sheet. And that's where the term comes from. And that's what they're describing. But in a system that's floating exchange, and there's no fixed convertibility, fractional reserve to what? If dollars are held, it's, so the banking system in and of itself, it becomes a different system. So when we look at modern day banking, simply put, we talked about Walmart issuing, credits when you buy a Walmart gift card, or, an airline issuing miles, and so on and so forth. I think it's probably useful to think about the money story, like the kind of money stories we tell each other, how do we come to use monetary systems? And then to me, to the degree that a government issues a currency, obviously the money story is in that regard. We don't have to be talking about all money, but the US dollar that's issued by the US government, the government issued that currency to further some sort of objective to meet, for public purpose. So, the government issues that currency in order to be able to extract goods and services from the economy and from the non-government sector. And so once you understand that, and you understand, as we talked about, the sequence that the government spends first, then it could collect taxes and so forth. But, the start of the sequence is first the government imposes the tax obligation. And that's what sets the terms of relative value. It sets the tax obligation and it decides, it basically sets how much it's willing to pay for goods and services. And that
back to physics and relative value versus like relative position. Yeah.
Right. And then everything else in the economy finds its indifference levels, right? If it takes 2 days to harvest a bushel of corn, but it takes, 1 day to harvest a bushel of wheat, then you could argue that in terms of labor, wheat is going to be half as valuable as corn. And all these relative value relationships sort of fall out, but you have that first input price from the government and that which it, the amount that it pays. And it really only needs to set one price. So going back to your example, it might set the price on what it pays for 1 day's wage for, a laborer. And, it might be a tiered system. It might be a system where if you're an unskilled laborer, you make a certain amount. If you're a soldier, you make a certain amount. If you're a skilled laborer, some sort of master, you're a blacksmith. If you're a carpenter, so on and so forth, you get a certain amount. But once it sets those prices, the economy, the market is good at setting relative value, once it has that input. And then, the relative value sort of falls from there. So, when you bring it back to the banking system and you realize it's so why do banks issue deposits? Where do commercial bank deposits come from? I mean, the bank's issuing deposits to further its business. It's trying to it issues loans. It issues loans because those loans earn interest. And that's the business model, simply put. I mean, banks do a lot more than that these days, but, in the first instance, banking is issuing a loan and collecting a VIG.
So my deposit's their liability, and so they need an asset to offset that, and that's what the loan creates. And it also creates an asset liability on that side as well. So
for me, so when you look at the banking system and the concept of fractional reserve, you realize it doesn't make sense in a fixed exchange world where loans create deposits, and by definition, any requisite reserves, because in the first instance, to be short reserves is to have a negative entry on your, in your reserve account. Is to be in debt, so to speak, to the federal system. So the way we say it is it's about price, not quantity. Banks aren't reserve constrained, or bank lending isn't reserve constrained. Bank lending is constrained by the cost of money, or the cost of reserves can be prohibitive. If the banks know that they're going to pay a penalty rate on a reserve loan from the Fed or on overdraft, so in the first instance that reserve requirement, if the system is net short reserves, is an overdraft at the Fed. If the penalty rate is so high that it offsets the interest income from the loan, then the banks don't make the loan. So it's always about price, not quantity. And, once you sort of understand that, you realize, it sort of informs certain things. Like you understand that, quantitative easing is probably not going to promote more bank lending, because you realize that the banks, if the financial sector sells its stock of treasuries in exchange for reserves, that does not change its ability to make loans. to any degree. I mean, first of all, like treasuries are good enough collateral. You could post treasuries as collateral in the repo markets to pay. So like, once you understand the plumbing of the system, you realize that, it's just an asset swap. They're just trading, time deposits for demand deposits, so to speak, when you do QE. So it doesn't really change anything. And then you start to realize that if QE is not going to necessarily promote lending, and then you understand that if the Fed's buying bonds from the private sector, so if the government issues bonds to finance its deficit, right? The difference between its, expenditure and what it was able to collect in taxes. And if there's a deficit, if that number is negative, then it offsets that by borrowing the difference. And, going back to your should banks be, should the government be run like a household? And yep. That's where these analogies come from. So it's like, okay, so the government needs to borrow the difference. But once you understand that if the Treasury sells us bonds and that's borrowing, but then the Fed buys those bonds back from us, could the Fed not have just bought the bonds from the Treasury in the first place? And then you could take it a step further. To the degree that the Fed is an agent of government, the Federal Reserve is a department of the U.S. Treasury system, and answers to Congress and so forth. And so to the degree that the Fed is, when you aggregate the entire government, is a component of the government, what does it mean for one government agency to borrow by selling bonds to another agent of the government? And then, so once you sort of understand these things, you start to realize that these relationships are sort of different. You realize that the issuing of bonds is more about, managing the interest rate, and it's more about monetary policy than it is about financing fiscal. And then that goes even back to a fixed exchange system. The government's had the ability to deficit spend even on a fixed exchange. The problem is the more currency that's available in the private sector is the more demand you potentially have on your gold reserves, which threatens your peg, your ability to maintain the peg. So a way to do that, or a way to keep people from, if to the degree that you deficit spend, a way to keep people from sort of demanding that gold, converting, those dollars to gold, you offer them a time deposit that pays them interest. Gold doesn't pay any interest. So that gives them a more attractive alternative. So, but that was always more about the monetary policy. The borrowing already occurred, or the spending, I should say, already occurred. The deficit spending already occurred. This was just a way to maintain this policy of, the gold backing, which was always just a monetary policy mechanism to begin with. It never really had anything to do with fiscal.
You said in there that issuance of bonds affects interest rates. So one of the dumb questions I always like to ask people is why do we have bonds? So for example, I know it allegedly goes back to the Rothschild family that, they got tired of basically financing or subsidizing monarchs in war, and they would finance both sides. Whoever won the war got to then enforce the contracts to make sure they got paid by the previous deposed dictator. And then actually, if then the winner didn't pay them back either, then they would finance a military to overthrow that leader. So this is the way the Rothschilds actually made their money, was by financing, monarchs and dictators and reaping the rewards of that. So they got tired of doing that. So they're like, how do we unlock all of this, wealth of this landed gentry, because they're basically sitting on land wealth that they're, land rich, cash poor. So they allegedly, one of the Rothschild, I think it was Nathan Rothschild in England or the UK, came up with the idea of, government bonds. And that way they could trade in government bonds instead of having to trade with monarchs. And also they could get the landed gentry to start putting some of their wealth into bonds. And then they had this tradable market where the Rothschilds could make money and they didn't have to worry about, dealing with deposed monarchs. But then, that's, roughly 200 years ago. And then we always move forward. And I always think, like, why do we have bonds in general? Like, why do we even issue bonds? And like you're saying, it affects the interest rate. So, explain to me why bonds? Why do we even have them? Why do we need fixed income?
Well, I mean, going back to the story you just told about the Rothschilds. I mean, in that story, are they saying that the Rothschilds, in essence, convinced the monarchs to issue bonds that they purchased?
Yeah.
But so to me, so that just goes back to what me and you have talked about before, where it's, if you think about it further, you realize that it's no different. So if the Rothschilds were financing governments,
mm-hmm.
meaning what? They gave the governments gold, I assume would be how that story is told. Maybe they provided the governments gold and silver, which the governments used to finance wars and excursions. That was already a bond. They gave the governments gold. The governments gave them back conceivably a note, some receipt that the government owes them that debt. So there was always a bond. There was always this financial asset that was this time deposit. This debt instrument. And so to the degree that they then formalized it and had the governments actually issue bonds that prints the crown's, seal on it and so forth. I mean, all they did was formalize an arrangement that always existed.
And that's what that's doing, like you said, and I want to get into this, like the time value of money or the time value of credit or what's moneyness or money good. But I think allegedly part of the reason in the story that I'm recounting that was told was to actually also have a tradable instrument that would unlock the wealth of the landed gentry, right? Because otherwise they were sitting on that wealth. They weren't participating. So now they could create an entire asset class where they weren't just trading, contra trading with monarchs. They now get to trade with actual individuals or landed gentry in England.
So they were creating liquidity for an unliquid asset. And to that degree, that part of the story is more interesting than the story of the creation of bonds. It's to the degree that you create a stock exchange to provide liquidity to, your pieces of joint stock corporations that you otherwise would have to find a private seller to buy on an exchange. You generate a lot more liquidity. To me, it's if you ask me why do we have bonds today, I don't presume to know the answer why we have bonds today. What I can answer is why or what bonds do currently. I mean, currently the issuance of bonds provides an instrument that the Fed uses to implement monetary policy, or at least that's how it was when I first came into this, industry and started learning about these things. So before the global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve System was not a system that was replete with, excess reserves as it is now, post QE and all these untraditional policies at the Fed, these unconventional policies that the Fed implemented, in response to the global financial crisis. So in the system before, we had it kind of reminds me of like this, of the way we manage supply chains with on-demand inventory, where one of the reasons why we have so many pricing pressures as we have now is because of, the concept of on-demand inventory, where you efficiently only carry about as much as you think you're going to sell in a short period of time. And because the supply chain is efficient, you could always replenish your inventories, in short order. So you don't need to stockpile. And because stockpiling is an inefficient use of capital, right? So the way the Federal Reserve System was working before the global financial crisis, as far as settlement balances were concerned, is we had a system where the system at the end of the day always had just about as much reserves or settlement balances as were necessary for all payments to clear and all regulatory obligations to be met, like reserve requirements. And so to the degree that, we go into the next day and, Jason's Mutiny Bank makes a new loan, a new $1 million loan. At that point, if the reserve requirement's 10%, the system's now 100 $100,000 short, right? Reserves. And so in that environment, the Fed would maintain monetary policy by providing liquidity or providing reserves. So, but there's also another instance where, which I think that example is kind of easier for people to understand. You grow the balance sheet, you need more reserves. They have to come from somewhere. So the Fed, lender of last resort, provides those reserves at a cost. And so it goes back to what I was saying before about it being about price and not quantity. But there's another example, which is actually just as common, where, I pay off my $1 million loan to the Mutiny Bank. Well, so now the system is, to the degree that, it's the inverse. Now the system has $100,000 of excess reserves. In the system that we had before, those excess reserves put downward pressure on the overnight interest rate because all money's trying to find a home. That's how we understand competition and difference levels. To the degree that you have 100,000 excess reserves and you're earning 0 on them, at the margin, the overnight interest rate has fallen to 0. Well, if the Fed's maintaining a positive interest rate, so let's just say it's 2004 or 5 and the interest rate is, 4%, at the margin, the interest rate's falling to 0. That's putting downward pressure on those reserves. So to the degree that somebody is borrowing reserves overnight at 4% here, you'd be willing to lend them the 100K at anything above 0. So it becomes this, race to the bottom where, you loan those excess reserves to somebody for, 3.9%. Well, now whoever they were borrowing for and paying 4% before that, you gave it to them for 3.9. Now they have 100K in reserves that are earning 0. So that competition drives, we understand market dynamics, drives that, puts downward pressure on reserves, puts pressure on it towards 0. And so what the Fed would do in that instance is, it's simple. The Fed would come in and do open market operations and mop up those excess reserves. The Fed would mop up those excess reserves by selling you a treasury, a bond from, off its balance sheet. And so instead you would sit in a time deposit, earn an interest rate, a positive rate, and not be putting downward pressure on the reserves. So those open market operations is how the Fed sort of hit its target rate. It was maintenance, interest rate maintenance policy. Well, once we moved into the world of having excess reserves post quantitative, QE 1, 2, and 3, Operation Twist, so on and so forth, the Fed, also changed policy and started paying interest on reserves. Well, it's something they always could have done. I mean, it's funny, for the 3 years before the global financial crisis, Warren would always say, I would always hear Warren say, and maybe it wasn't even 3 years, maybe it was only like a year before or whatever, but I would hear Warren say that, instead of doing all these open market operations, the Fed could just pay interest on excess reserves at its overnight rate and job done. You always hit your target rate. And it's what they started doing after that. So right now, interest on excess reserves is something that we all have come to understand, but they weren't around then. So, that's what bonds do today. Earlier I gave the example of in fixed exchange, bonds sort of sequestered money so that money wouldn't claim, wouldn't deplete the reserves, the gold reserves. And so that was a way of maintaining that form of monetary policy. So it seems to have always, as far as I can tell, been just been a method for achieving, monetary policy objectives, not really financing fiscal policy.
One of the biggest or consistent fallacies I see across like Twitter or just in life in general is this idea of Fed money printer go burr, especially here in crypto. But as we both know, the Fed doesn't actually print money. The Fed, if anything, prints reserves. And that's what you keep talking about, the reserve requirements. And then what those reserve requirements, how those affect the banks. But like we were talking about banks, the reserve requirements don't matter as much as just their capital equity and the amount of leverage they can use on that capital equity to create new loans. And therefore, the banks are the ones that actually can create money out of whole cloth when they create a new loan for any sort of useful purpose. So if I was going to, I think, we both know our Richard Werner and like the Princes of the Yen, that in the 1980s, the Japanese decided to use, window operations to incentivize or force their banks to lend more than they normally should to the general public. And that's what created the big boom during the 80s in Japan. So I'm wondering, just let me ask this in a different way. If you were in charge and you were a dictator of America, PJ Pierre, dictator of America, how would you, this is the monetary velocity issue that we're not seeing because of the, QE is just reserves, is how would you force the monetary velocity to increase? What kind of window operations or what kind of monetary operations would you force the banks to do to create an interesting capital and really get to move money through the system, which we've just seen monetary velocity collapse throughout QE?
Right. So, and going to what you said about banks being able to issue, money out of whole cloth or, issue currency out of thin air. I'm actually not offended by the idea of, money printer go burr. I think all government spending is money printing. It's issuance of debt, and all taxation is, extinguishing that debt or, canceling, that debt. So to me, I don't find that term particularly controversial. I think to the degree that's controversial is that, I think people on Main Street and who, don't really pay attention to monetary operations and their, money markets isn't their thing. They're not bond traders, so on and so forth. Most people think of cash as being a much larger part of, the monetary system than it actually is. So they're imagining the printing of new cash. And whereas if the Fed adds reserves to the system, no one, the person on Main Street isn't thinking that, the Fed just printed money. It's when the government sends a stimulus check to somebody, that's when they think the money printer go burr. So to them, money printing is just a euphemism for fiscal policy. Non-tax financed fiscal policy, right? So to me, I mean, it's inapplicable, in that regard. But transitioning back to this dynamic of speaking about the banking system, and I think I might have
if I forced you, it's fine. If I forced you to run the banking system and start, issuing loans, creating money out of whole cloth, trying to increase monetary velocity, how would you do it?
How would I?
What's a prudent way? Yeah, what do you think's the right way of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, so if you restricted me to try to do it via the banking system, then I would say that you don't do it by reserve. You don't do it by monetary policy that creates a condition of excess reserves, because bank lending isn't reserve constrained in the first place. I say you might do it by targeting that which actually does constrain bank lending, which is capital requirements, collateral demanded for liquidity, so on and so forth. So it's these regulatory requirements that actually set the terms, create the rules. And then the banks go out there and play the game and try to win the game and try to compete with each other. So to the degree that I had to do it through the banking system, I would say that you would probably want to loosen regulations on, capital requirements, if we use the global financial crisis as the example, so the global financial crisis was a crisis of liquidity. In many ways, maybe in the first instance, right? And, I think that's where it became crisis. And that lack of liquidity, or it was basically a situation where financial institutions stopped wanting to lend each other. I think you talked about it when we were in San Diego. It's things that were money good were no longer money good. You went to bed, money good. You woke up the next day and you need to post different collateral because, that which was posted is no longer acceptable. So in that kind of situation, you had, where financial stability was threatened by, lack of liquidity. We decided the answer was to make it so that banks are more constrained, have to keep more available liquidity, have to have more capital to backstop any potential losses that they may need to absorb. And in that environment, we tightened regulations on banks at the same time that we claim to have been pushing on a string by doing QE and buying bonds off their balance sheets, which basically robs them of the interest income they were getting for the bonds, which interest income would have replenished their capital and made it so that they had more of that capital, which we wanted them to have. And we purported to be stoking, lending by, engaging in these unconventional monetary policies. But at the same time, the regulatory regime was contracting credit issuance. And not to say that's the only reason credit issuance contracted. You had a recession, and the economy as a whole became less creditworthy than it was before. So it might have just been prudent for the banks to not make as many loans to the degree that they're not in business to lose money. So in that environment, you would have wanted to basically encourage risk taking, not discourage risk taking. So I think that's done on the regulatory side more so than it is on the, the reserve requirement is a form of regulation, but that regulation has to do with the liquidity management side more than it does, the capital side. And
I was thinking about like you're just saying, and I think hopefully we'll touch on this more later too, is like ideally the government would be counter-cyclical to the pro-cyclicality of a general economy, like as the American economy is in general. But part of it I was thinking about is even if I was running the banking system, and not just because I'm an entrepreneur, is I would want, banks to lend to entrepreneurs, business owners for CapEx spending, and not necessarily to mortgages or financialized products. And creating that way, you create bubbles for asset classes for people that are already rich. But by increasing the money velocity in CapEx and maybe entrepreneurial loans, that would be an interesting way of increasing that money velocity, but also increasing the general economy in America. But as with everything, comes with commensurate trade-offs, right? If we reduce capital requirements, we're making banks a little bit shakier, right? And in the Minsky sense, it's stability breeds instability. It might look good for a while. And quite frankly, if you're giving loans to entrepreneurs, you might have a lot of defaults. So it's like, I'm not sure if there is a perfect answer, right? To like, what would you do if you controlled the banking system?
Yeah, so I agree. So, in the example you gave earlier, you sort of confined me to using the banking system and credit issuance to try to promote economic growth and promote money velocity. So in that regard, you sort of have to do it by expanding bank balance sheets, which inherently potentially, puts you at higher risk of a future, crisis or some sort of a, tightening of credits. But there's a way you could do that if that's the objective. Now, if you ask me if I think the banking system would have been the best way to try to promote economic growth, I would say that I don't think so. I mean, and going back to what you said about, about the government being countercyclical and, wanting banks to maybe do, I think, to say it differently than what you said, but it's the same thing, wanting banks to do loans that are more productive, loans that sort of increase the real wealth in the economy, as opposed to basically like lending against financial assets, which doesn't necessarily, create any real wealth per se. I absolutely would tend to agree with you, because to me, it's when I think about the banking system and the way we sort of do things, It's, when the economy slows down, banks being, run as private enterprise, contract their balance sheets and, act pro-cyclically and stop providing liquidity per se. And when the economy's, running red hot, when we have lots of economic growth. So when, whether it's the 90s .com bubble or it's the subprime mortgage bubble, or, you go further back in the savings and loans and so on and so forth. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and, you might have heard Warren say it before, it's whenever you look at a lot of the good times where we've had the kind of economic growth that we sort of champion, it's always corresponded with some sort of behavior that in hindsight we would try to not engage in moving forward. Like, a lot of the growth in the 80s was driven by, junk bonds and the SNL crisis and bubble. And then that, ends badly. And then we go, we don't want to do that again. But we wanted all the growth that promoted and stimulated. So it's like, we haven't really come to terms with what's really been the drivers of economic growth, in most of our lifetimes. But yeah, so to me, it would actually make more sense if banks, when the economy was running red hot, if they actually started tightening credit and started saying, things are kind of, there's a bit of irrational exuberance, to use Greenspan's term here. And maybe I'm not going to buy into the hype. And maybe I'm going to say, maybe the future is not going to be as rosy as we all, believe it to be because, of recency bias and so forth. And to the degree that you would want the banking system to do that, you could do that with regulations. If the Fed was a actual effective regulator, we always talk about, it's the concept that the Fed's job is to take away the punch bowl. But the idea has been reduced down to taking away the punch bowl is to raise interest from 4.5% to 5%. It's like, if you really want to take away the punch bowl, you just tighten restrictions on, you tighten the regulations around lending and you tighten the punch bowl. You could leave interest rates where it's at. And then you don't have to drive up the rate that the government has to pay on deficits. And then the people at the CBOE don't have to tell you that, well, at this rate, the government's going to be bankrupt and Social Security, we're not going to make Social Security payments in 2093 or, whatever. And you don't have to hear, all this nonsensical stuff and people projecting these present circumstances into the future sort of indefinitely. You could actually do some more direct things. Now, most people don't like hearing that because they see it as being sort of like a controlled economy, right? And I can't necessarily disagree with that, but I mean, it's always a controlled economy, right? Free markets exist within the framework of the rules that the government sets about in a system where the currency, the thing of final settlement, is a public monopoly that's only issued by the government. So in what world is that free when the thing at the center of it is a monopoly? Currency is monopoly issuance. So by definition, monopoly is the exact opposite of a free competitive market. And that's what, that's the foundation of the entire, of our entire, market system. So once you sort of understand these things and you realize it's not about black and white, free market controlled economy, it's all about degree. And we're always somewhere on the spectrum. Then you start to understand that, okay, you may shift more on the spectrum if that meets your objectives, but you have to understand what those objectives are and how you actually achieve those objectives instead of doing the things that we keep doing. I mean, it's like you look at Japan, we brought up the JGB situation before. You have Japan where interest rates have been zero for, decades, all my financial life for sure. And most of my all my adult life, most of my life, it's sort of been in that's been the situation. And the idea is that these low rates are supposed to be stimulative, but Japan, it's never, it never stimulates. And then anytime they do get an uptick in economic growth, on the fiscal side, they raise taxes, which by definition is contractionary fiscal policy. But, they could get away with doing that because, the Bank of Japan has all this, expansionary monetary policy, so they could afford to raise taxes. It's nonsensical. I mean, it's no wonder they don't have, they haven't been able to generate the type of economic growth they're looking for. I mean, it's, they have their, the accelerator and the brake pedal sort of backwards. They're stepping on the brake and wondering why the car's not accelerating. And
I'm glad you brought back up the JGB trade, because actually it was I was actually thinking about it in a different sense, in that, like, you referenced, like, that was always the widowmaker trade, that everybody was like shorting JGBs, like they got carried out on a stretcher because they never made any money. But what I think is interesting now is there's a lot of people that say, with their yield curve control and wanting just 25, just stick it at 25 bips, the pressure, almost like an ERM, might break through there, like almost like a Soros style trade. But I've watched everybody making fun of people that want to short JGBs, is like, do you not remember the widowmaker trade? Are you an idiot? And I really wonder if this boils down to, like, the old adage in a bull market, you want a 20-year-old, in the bear market, you want a 60-year-old, is like, do people have too much scar tissue where now may be the actual opportune time to be seeing if you can put pressure on JGBs and shorting that JGB market? And we could see it, even though they want to peg it to 25 bips, it could break through there.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if there's an answer to this, but, like, it's just, it's interesting to me, the scar tissue.
Yeah, it's fair. And I think the point you're making is a fair point. I think you should always question, what sort of becomes conventional wisdom. I mean, the concept of it's always been this way, we talked about that before. It had to start at some point, and it might have been different before that point, in time and whenever you had that sort of paradigm shift. But to me, I guess I kind of look at it differently. So to me, when I look at, the, U.S. treasuries and our Federal Reserve System, and I look at, JGB and the Bank of Japan and their monetary system, in those systems, the interest rate's a policy variable. So, it's not really market determined per se. I guess you could argue that the market sort of sets an indifference level. So if the Fed targets, overnight rates, and then the market sets rates on 3 month, 2 year, 10 year, 30 year, whatever, but it's an indifference level. It's the rates on a 2-year bond are higher than the rates on a 3-month bond because they include the rates on the 3-month bond, right? But they include, 2 years worth of 3-month bond. So, and it's the compounding. So it's all just in different levels. So when the Fed, like, there's no market, you and I had this discussion in San Diego where it's like, you have like monetary economists, like people who work in central banking, who say things like, if we get this amount of inflation, or, if we see, unemployment fall to this level, then rates have to go, rates will go up. And to me, it's that dynamic where, okay, so like the FOMC meets and the members, all vote on monetary policy. They vote on to stay, to hold, to cut, or to raise, and by how much, if they're making some sort of rate change. And I always like, it's like, how does that work? This dynamic that if inflation goes to this amount, or if unemployment falls to this amount, is there somehow some transmission mechanism that forces everyone's hands up and makes everyone vote on the rate hike? No, there isn't. Like, it's conceivable that you could have unemployment falling to 0 and inflation rising towards 10, and those 12 people could go in the room and sit on their hands and not raise rates. And as a trader, you have to sort of discount that possibility too, that it's just a policy variable, right? That's the reason that we're all sort of Fed watchers, is we want to know, like, what are they going to do? It's the reaction function that we're trying to target. There's not like this implicit, there's not this like natural force that moves these rates these ways, it's a policy variable. It's political. I mean, we try to say it's apolitical, but it's political to the degree that these 12 people decide based on their worldview and their politics and how they see things and their understanding of economics and what they think is important. Some people might think, lower unemployment is more important. Some people might think fighting inflation is more important. You're going to get a different outcome depending on those two views. And it's not mechanical.
Part of that, I was thinking like it's the form of Keynesian beauty contest, right? Of like their second and third order effects, and you're trying to figure out, what those are. And part of it is like you just said, it's like we even call it inflation expectations, and it's like, do we undershoot or overshoot expectations, right? It's not so. It's the relative value of expectations. Then what is the reaction function to the market expected? And did we overshoot or undershoot? And that's what kind of moved markets, and that's what I think that you're missing, like those kind of countervailing forces, and depending on who you're talking to. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, but we don't have time during this conversation, so I look forward to our future conversations. But part of it was we were talking about moneyness, time value of money, credit, all of those things. So I wanted to kind of get into like maybe, Perry Merling's, 4 prices of money, and just kind of talk about that a little bit, but we can save that for another time. But I know when we were talking about that the other day, and then earlier you referenced even with your dad into the 80s and 90s, talking about the gold standard and how like these historical antecedents tend to persist even when they're no longer, part of the colloquial way we deal with money or whatever finance topic we're talking about. But one of the ones you brought up to me was the Haitian dollar. So I'd like to kind of end on that story of tell me what is the Haitian dollar?
The Haitian dollar. So yeah. So obviously we all always hear when you talk about the theory of money, we hear about, the 3 main functions of money, or, to me, I'd say the 3 main functions of like the currency thing. And those are, obviously unit of account, medium of exchange, and store of value. And for me, these things have always been sort of, I don't want to say that they've been abstract, but, you understand these concepts and you see them and how they work in the economy. But yeah, like I was saying to you, is like, I was traveling to Haiti back in 2016, I think it was. And, both of my parents immigrated from Haiti. So, I'm an American of Haitian descent. And it was my first time being back in Haiti since I was, a child. And, I'm traveling, Haiti, and I'm sort of interacting with people and, interacting in their economy. And, everything's quoted in the Haitian dollar. And, when I went to Haiti, I exchanged some of my dollars for Haitian goud, which is the Haitian currency, the currency issued by the Haitian government. And, I think at the time the exchange rate was like maybe like 58 to 1 is a pretty, is a pretty big difference. But like everything was quoted in either, every price was quoted in either USD, because USD trades in Haiti. You could buy anything in USD even the government accepts USD in the payment of taxes, which is nonsensical. That probably explains why their currency is at 58 to 1. It just goes to show you that, taking advice from the IMF doesn't really get you. Shows you
also how pervasive the dollar is. Yeah. And the,
well, right. Because, they're taking advice from the IMF, and the IMF is saying, peg your money to the dollar, or take this dollar, borrow this, money, take this dollar denominated debt. So now the Haitian government's trying to figure out how to get dollars. So they're like, yeah, well, we'll accept dollar in tax payments because we needed to pay this, external debt and so forth. But, that's an entirely different story. We could touch on another point, but yeah, so prices are either quoted in dollars, US dollars, or they're quoted in the Haitian dollar. And the whole time I'm there, I was like, so where do I get a Haitian dollar from? I was like, so everyone said, they'd say, well, no, the Haitian dollar is 5 goud. So the Haitian goud is, trades at a 5 to 1 ratio with the Haitian dollar. And so I was like, okay, but what is the Haitian dollar? Like, is there is there like a Haitian dollar like printed? Like, so there's two currencies, or is the Haitian dollar just a denomination? Like, is that like $100 bill, like, or a $5 bill, or a 5 good bill, I guess, or something like so they're like, well, no, Haitian dollar is it's just an amount, and it equals 5 good. And like, and I'm like, man, that doesn't make it. So I'm scratching my head. So, you go to get gas, and the gas is, trading for, however many, Haitian dollars it is at that point. So it's probably,
I'm thinking about the difficulty of that. Yeah. Like if I'm traveling and I go to Brazil for the real or whatever, it's like, I'm always going, okay, that's how many real, and I translate that back to dollars. But now you're going, okay, this is an Haitian dollar that equals this amount of good, and then good equals this amount of USD. It's like you're having to do a double.
Yeah, you're having to do a
double calculation,
double conversion. And so the whole time I'm going like, why are we doing this double conversion? So it's like, okay, yeah, the Haitian dollar is 5-1 to the good, and the good is 58-1 to the US dollar. So I'm like, okay, great. Like, so then eventually, like, I kind of get, I get somewhere. I get to, like, one of my uncle's houses, and he's, relatively educated. He's a pretty successful businessman in Haiti. And, I asked him, I said, so, I asked him, like, uncle, like, explain to me this Haitian dollar concept. And he goes, oh, well, the Haitian dollar is not really a thing. And I was like, so now I'm even more confused, right? Like, what do you mean the Haitian dollar is not a thing? He's like, well, yeah, the Haitian dollar doesn't really exist, but the Haitian good is so devalued with respect to the dollar, and our economy is so dollarized. So it's like a matter of national pride that we quote our prices in Haitian dollars. So it only seems like it's 1/5 as devalued as it would be. So instead of just thinking that the good is 58-1 to the dollar, he's in essence telling me that they're looking at it as the Haitian dollar is 11.6. Instead of 58-1, it's 11.6-1. And I'm like, okay, so that looks better, I guess. But I'm like, everyone's doing all of these calculations and all of that as a matter of national pride. The answer just kind of didn't sit with me. And, but I enjoyed the rest of my vacation and kept doing the double conversions. And then, eventually when I got back stateside, and it kind of, I don't know how, maybe like a few weeks back. And I'm like, man, I got to figure out what this Haitian dollar thing is. This is a world with Google. I have good internet. I can find this information. So I start researching the Haitian dollar. And it turns out that, at around the time of World War I, the US had invaded and occupied Haiti for 20 years, like from 1914 to like 1934. And they had done it at the behest of American business interests that were growing in Haiti at the same time that the political influence of the Germans was growing in Haiti. So, and then, and obviously we had our conflict with Germany. So that posed a understandable problem for American business people. And the solution to that was to sort of invade and expel the German influence out of Haiti. But one of the byproducts of that was, at the time, they pegged the Haitian good to the dollar 5-1. And the Haitian dollar is literally just Haitian dollar pair. It's 5-1. Well, that peg no longer exists, but now everyone still quotes in this pairing of 5 good is 1 Haitian dollar, even though the peg doesn't exist anymore. And so that was the legacy. So now I understood where the legacy came from. They were doing it since then. They continued doing it. And that's where the term Haitian dollar comes from. That's why it's called Haitian dollar. So it's like me saying euro dollar when I'm talking about the euro dollar pair. So now it all made sense. Me being an FX trader, I started in FX. I'm like, okay, now I get that. And that makes sense. But what occurred to me, and the reason why you're, telling me to tell this story, was as it relates back to the 3 functions of money. As soon as I kind of understood where it came from, it occurred to me, I was like, Haiti, for me at least, it was the first place that I went where I actually saw 3 different constructs posing those 3 different roles all at the same time, and in real time, where the Haitian good was the medium of exchange, and the Haitian dollar was the unit of account. It's what they were pricing everything in. even though it didn't actually exist. So it's just a unit of account, like a unit of measure. And then you had the desire to save in dollars because it was a better store of value than the Haitian goud, meant that the dollar was acting as the dominant store of value. So you had these three different constructs in one economy acting as these three functions, and these, largely illiterate, Haitian citizens all handling all these conversions in real time seamlessly. If you ask any of them, like, what are the three functions of money? Most of them don't even, probably don't even like store of value. Like they haven't ever thought through the concepts, but they're actually, it's a real world case study for those three functions of money and three different things doing it in real time, where to me it was like a better case study than anything I find here stateside.
The other thing I love about that is like, no shade to humans, but we're irrational, right? And that's always my argument for, like you're saying, controlled economy or whatever, is like, if we actually had a counter-cyclical or countervailing force with the government, we would be able to constrain kind of boom and bust cycles, hopefully a little bit more. But it's governments aren't a monolith, and it's humans involved in governments, and humans being humans, we love pro-cyclicality, and nobody likes to remove the punch bowl. So that's always kind of one of the arguments against. And so I brought you on to talk about money because I love always our conversations, but they're usually, a lot lengthier. I'm going to unfortunately cut this one off here, but like maybe, we try to cover some deep subjects. So hopefully we can have you back on to like kind of dive into different segments, but also want to kind of give a place for people to find you. Do you even remember what your Twitter handle is now? I have it if you don't remember it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Tatiana Pierre or something like.
Right. So it is. So now I got to know what that means. So once again, on Twitter, it's at Tatiana, Tatiana Pierre, Pierre. But what's up with Tatiana?
I think whenever I was trying to like set up my Twitter handle, PJ Pierre wasn't available, and Tatiana Pierre was the name of like my daughter's favorite teddy bear.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was like your childhood nickname.
Tatiana is a member of the Pierre family, so I used her bear's name as my Twitter handle.
So you're already setting yourself up for failure. You're just assuming nobody was ever going to follow you on Twitter. Like, yeah, that's why you're.
Yeah, at that time I had no desire to have a social media presence. Exactly. I still don't really have much of a desire for one.
I appreciate it. We'll put the link for Tatiana Pierre on Twitter in the show notes. And then I was going to say, it's understandable given the firm you work for, because I was going to say, we'll put links to Denali Asset Management in the show notes, but we are not going to do that because Scott will kill me. And shout out to Scott and Brad, but you have one of the most secretive family offices in the country. You guys hate publicity, but you're all brilliant and great characters. So I'd love to get you more publicly facing, but you guys try to shun it as much as possible. So once again, I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to our future conversations.
I had fun, thanks again for having me. Thanks for talking me into this, as a lot of people probably don't know, this is my first time ever doing a podcast or anything public facing like this. So you had to sort of cajole me a little bit, maybe hold my hand and tell me it wasn't going to be so scary. But yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it, and, I'm happy to come on again in the future if so desired.
Yeah, like a drug dealer, I gave you the first taste, and now I'm going to get you back on for more. I'm going to abuse the privilege. So, thanks, PJ.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, we'd appreciate if you would share this show with friends and leave us a review on iTunes, as it helps more listeners find the show and join our amazing community. To those of you who already shared or left a review, thank you very sincerely. It does mean a lot to us. If you'd like more information about Mutinyfund, you can go to mutinyfund.com. For any thoughts on how we can improve the show or questions about anything we've talked about here on the podcast today, drop us a message via email. I'm Taylor@mutinyfund.com, and Jason is Jason@mutinyfund.com, or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at Taylor Pearson ME, and Jason is at Jason Mutiny. To hear about new episodes or get our monthly newsletter with reading recommendations, sign up at mutinyfund.com/newsletter.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Mutinyfund, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed to not make specific trade recommendations nor reference past or potential profits. Listeners are reminded that managed futures, commodity trading, forex trading, and other alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they're not suitable for all investors, and you should not rely on any of the information as a substitute for the exercise of your own skill and judgment in making a decision on the appropriateness of such investments. Visit mutinyfund.com/disclaimer for more information.